I want you to take a moment to think about childhood milestones. There are so many, the tiny infant ones, like rolling over and sitting up and taking your first steps, eating solid food. And then there are the childhood ones, like riding a bike and tying your shoes and heading off to school. And as children make their way into pre-adolescence, tweenhood, there are new moments, this tug of war between wanting to grow up and wanting to stay put and be a playful little kid. In those moments, kids dip their toes in the water to try on independence, doing things like staying home alone for the first time. That's exactly what one little boy in a tiny Midwest town did in the fall of 1990, a decision that should have been safe but ended in a heartbreaking tragedy. As of today, nearly 34 years have gone by without answers. Some of his family has died, but his two little sisters and extended family await answers, ones that somebody out there is holding on to. This is A Simpler Time, True Crime, the murder of Nelson Jones. Nelson Lewis Jones was born to parents Nelson and Margaret on August 17, 1979 in Junction City, Kansas. He was the oldest of three, the only brother to two little sisters, Melissa and Elizabeth. Nelson's parents would not stay together, and his mom remarried a man named Dennis Bergstrom. Margaret and Dennis had a home in the tiny town of Hope, Kansas. He attended the Hope schools right up the road in town, which were part of the Rural Vista Unified School District. Nelson and his family were also devout members of the First Christian Church of Hope. Hope is the epitome of a small Midwestern town. I grew up in a town in upstate New York that had less than 10,000 people, and I thought that was small. But Hope has less than 500 residents. Jerry Davis is the current Dickinson County Sheriff where Hope is located, and he described it back then as, quote, a community where everybody got along, everybody knew each other, and everybody trusted each other, end quote. Just for a little bit of back history on the town, Hope was established by a handful of people in 1871, and in 1878, David Jacob Eisenhower, who is the father of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, lived on a 160-acre ranch adjacent to the town of Hope, and he moved to Hope himself. He helped generate business there, opening up a general store with his business partner, Milton Good. The store was called Good and Eisenhower. Eisenhower was kind of socially reclusive, so he used more of just using his money to stimulate the economic growth of Hope, but he wasn't involved in the day-to-day operations as much. The railroad arrived in Hope in 1885 and helped bring in travelers from Chicago. But that was kind of about it. That's where it peaked in terms of population and expansion, and today the population hasn't changed much since those 1800s days. For decades and decades, it's just been somewhere between 300 and 600 people. In fact, now, since it's no longer used for that railroad space, they have even less people than they had back then. The town motto is, "There will always be hope in Kansas." Hope is located in central Kansas, north of Wichita. Based on just the maps, it's one of those towns you blink and you're through it. Kansas Highway 4 is the main road that just goes through it, and Kansas Highway 4 is a 340-mile highway that stretches all the way across the Sunflower State for a good distance. But it's just one long road with traffic flowing one lane each way, so it's probably not the highway you're picturing. I'll have a picture of it on the Instagram. The closest thing to an interstate is I-70, which is almost half an hour drive just to get to the interstate. So whatever small town you're picturing, picture it even smaller. Nelson Jones was a rambunctious and adventurous little boy. In an interview with WIBW 13 News in Topeka in 2022, his sister Melissa shared that he loved being outside. He loved fishing and baseball. Melissa shared this story of how he had a water hose hanging over the watershed, and he convinced his sisters to play with him and how they would swing on it like Tarzan, and it was all his idea, and she said he was constantly coming up with things like this. Nelson also loved dogs. According to a February 1990 article in the Wichita Eagle, when he was in 5th grade, he wanted a greyhound dog, and he had an agreement with his family about keeping his grades up at school and then also building a proper fence and shelter to be able to adopt a program called Greyhounds as Pets. This place helped pair retired greyhound racing dogs with new forever owners, and Nelson held up his end of the bargain. He really took it seriously, he kept his grades up, and he did his part to meet all the adoption requirements. And they adopted a dog named Old Man, who sadly passed away from a pre-existing health condition just after adoption. But a few weeks later, he was able to adopt another greyhound from that same rescue, and he was featured in the newspaper with it, and there's a picture where he's seen cuddling the dog in the paper, and I'll share that on our Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod. It's the sweetest picture I've ever seen. So speaking of greyhounds, on the fall Saturday of October 27th, 1990, greyhound racing is what the family had set out to do. They were going to go from their home in Hope and travel south to Wichita to go to the Wichita Greyhound Park. This was about an hour-and-a-half drive, but Nelson had other plans. He really wanted to be left home alone while the rest of his family went. It's not that he didn't enjoy it, but right up the road at his school, the PTA was having a school carnival. He also wanted to ride his bike and play Nintendo and hang out with his friends. But here's the catch. Nelson had never stayed home alone before. And this level of staying home is quite a big jump. I can still remember some of my first times being home alone, and they were when my mom had quick, 10-minute errands to run. So his mom wasn't so sure, but he convinced her, and his sister recalled in an interview that in part that was because he had referenced hanging out with a friend that day. So I think his family, it was less of them thinking Nelson's going to be on his own for several hours today, and realistically they thought of it more as Nelson's just not coming with us. He's going to be with his friend most of the day, and he will probably just have a small window of home alone time until we get home. So with those plans in order, off they went. When the family returned home around 6 p.m., the house was quiet. They called out for Nelson but heard no answer. From what I saw in a picture, it was a smaller house, so I'm sure they assumed if he was home, he would have heard them and responded. The carnival was just up the road, literally a couple of blocks, so I'll share a Google Street View on the Instagram and you can see how close it was. So they decided to just go down there and try to catch up with him, assuming he was drawn into the games and the social festivities like most 11-year-olds would be. But when they got there, they didn't spot Nelson anywhere, so they spent some time there and thought maybe they just hadn't crossed paths, and they walked back home. So they returned to the home at 101 East 2nd Ave to check with friends and neighbors and see if he was with them. As a side note, the home no longer exists, but in that picture I shared, you'll see the general area it was located in. While Nelson's mom was in the midst of getting ready to ask around the neighborhood and making phone calls, Nelson's youngest sister Elizabeth had wandered into his bedroom. She called for her family, saying something along the lines of, "I found Nelson, but he looks all beat up." So the family rushed to the room and found Nelson lying motionless. He was in a kneeling position over his bed, almost like he was praying, and he was pale and blue. His mother quickly checked for a pulse and realized in horror that her son was dead. Nelson's sister Melissa recalled in an interview that her stepfather ran barefoot out of the house and down the road. He hoped that if he ran into the business district, he'd be able to locate a police officer and summon an ambulance. Deputy Jesse Best was a deputy police officer in Hope and lived just 2 doors down from Nelson's home. He was first on scene and immediately phoned the Dickinson County Sheriff's Office, who then reported on scene themselves. Nelson had been strangled to death. There were ligature marks around his neck that looked like some sort of small cord. However, a murder weapon wasn't immediately visible at the scene. This police force was not prepared for what they were going to see or any of the investigation that followed. This was not in their wheelhouse. It is absolutely the cliche of, this kind of thing didn't happen around here. And it truly didn't. Nelson's homicide was the first to occur in Hope since 1928. And it had been a full year since there had been a homicide in Dickinson County altogether. From what I've read, there hasn't been another one in Hope since. So knowing all of this, Dickinson County quickly called in the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. KBI officers arrived at the house by 1 a.m. on Sunday. The full-time leads on the case at the time were Dickinson County investigator Roger Williams and KBI agent Don Windsor. Dickinson County Sheriff Carl McDonald was also heavily involved. He even went to the school Nelson attended to meet with the children and answer questions from students and provide comfort to them. Interestingly enough, the school district had just implemented a plan in the months previous regarding crisis intervention and grief counseling. I'm certain they were shocked at having to put that plan into action so soon, or even at all. The authorities were baffled. They could not find any suspects, any motive, any weapon, anything. Sheriff McDonald said in an interview 4 days after the murder that they had interviewed a lot of people, but nobody saw or heard anything suspicious. Witnesses were able to help build a timeline, though. Witnesses in town had seen Nelson throughout the day, and they had seen him playing with friends and riding his bike around the town. They had seen him on his bike as late as 4:45 p.m. With his family arriving home around 6, that leaves just a little bit over an hour that the crime could have occurred in. But that was it. Nobody saw anyone suspicious lingering around his house. Nobody saw any fights breaking out between kids. Nobody heard a violent struggle or anything amiss. A few days after the murder, police said something to a few news outlets that I'm still perplexed about. At that time, they said they weren't sure if the case was truly a homicide or an accident or suicide. They knew the boy died from something strangling him around his neck, or at least that's what they suspected based on the ligature marks. But they went on to say that there was nothing actually wrapped around his neck and nothing nearby. But they say this several times over several days. The whole fact that, well, maybe it could have been an accident or a suicide, and maybe I'm just missing something here, but you can't strangle yourself accidentally and then remove the ligature after you die. And you certainly can't then go hide it, so I don't understand how they thought that. The only thing I can think of is that they felt the marks on his neck possibly were unrelated to his death and that the autopsy would provide clues to a different manner of death. But it still makes no sense to me, and ultimately it was ruled a homicide by strangulation. The KBI and the selected task force set up space in a mixed-use building in town. But McDonald was open about the lack of progress. In an interview with the Salina Journal on Friday, December 7th, 1990, he said, quote, "We've got no suspects. We've got no more than we had the Sunday after it happened," end quote. In the first couple of months after the homicide, detectives wondered if they needed to broaden their search and look for similar crimes. And one possibility was looking into the possible connection to a little girl who had gone missing in Wichita. In July of 1990, 9-year-old Nancy Shoemaker had gone to a neighborhood convenience store to buy ginger ale for her brother, who had an upset stomach. But she never made it home. At the time of Nelson's death, she was still missing, so police did want to consider that possibility. But they ruled it out shortly thereafter, and when 1990 ticked into 1991, Nancy's skeletal remains were found in a hedgerow in a rural area near Belle Plaine. That was in February, and by July of 1991, Doyle Lane was arrested for her murder, with his friend Donald Wacker arrested as an accomplice. She had been strangled to death. More and more, it didn't seem connected to cases in bigger towns. The answers seemed to be hiding somewhere in their tiny town, which was terrifying to his sisters. Melissa recalled being afraid to turn 11 because she thought she was going to be murdered. She was afraid of the dark and afraid of the killer still out there. October of 1991 marked a year since Nelson's murder. Sheriff Carl McDonald recalled what they had done early on to the Salina Journal. He said they spent 15 hours in the home to start, combing for evidence and clues. What evidence they did preserve has never been released to the public. In fact, little about the case has. Because the town is so small, he said that those working the task force interviewed almost every single person in town, and then they tracked down people who had left town and interviewed them. They also worked with the FBI out of Quantico, Virginia, to develop a profile of the killer, but they've never released that profile to the public. In this interview at the 1-year mark, McDonald said that they were, quote, a long way away from arresting anyone. But he did say that what they learned so far, he felt confident that the person who killed Nelson wouldn't strike again. He said, quote, "That was our concern at the start, but we have no reason to now believe people in Hope should be concerned," end quote. I really try to stick to facts on this podcast, but with such little information, I can't help but speculate. What makes them so sure? One thought I had was that maybe they think it was a boy around the same age as Nelson or a little older. Nelson was tiny from what I can tell from his pictures, and a bigger and older teen could have overpowered him. What if he invited one of them over to play Nintendo and they got into an argument? The idea of one little boy killing another reminds me of a case that happened in 1993 an hour south of where I live. In rural Steuben County, New York, 4-year-old Derek Roby was walking to summer day camp when a 13-year-old boy named Eric Smith lured him into the woods and brutally murdered him. Smith was actually tried as an adult, which made him the youngest murder defendant tried as an adult in New York State history. He was convicted but was paroled in 2022. In this instance, it seemed like Smith killed Roby impulsively, and it was both sexually motivated and a thrill kill. So is that something that could have happened here? Was an adolescent boy impulsively killing Nelson as a thrill or to seem tough? If so, it doesn't seem like he ever came forward or bragged to any of his peers at the time. If so, those peers haven't come forward all of these years later. So that would kind of kill the point of coming across as a tough guy. If it was a teen, I don't think that should be any indication that it was a one-time crime. If a person is able to be that violent before they hit adulthood, what's going to happen in the years to come? Nelson's mother, Margaret, did not believe her son's killer was a child. In an interview with the Salina Journal, she said she believed an adult did this crime, and that she and her family needed to see someone convicted of the murder so she could move into a new chapter of their lives. She said, quote, "I just know that one of these days it's going to happen again, and I don't want another parent to have to go through this," end quote. In another interview, Margaret speculated that someone may have been lying in wait for him when he came home from his friend's house. McDonald shared that back then, on a pretty regular basis, they would get a little bit of information. He felt the case was solvable with old-fashioned police work, but he said he could never guarantee a timeline. He thought it could take a while. The years ticked on with no new leads. In 1995, new life was breathed into the case. The case would be featured on the television special To Catch a Killer, and the governor's office was putting up a $5,000 reward for information. Officials were shocked when the TV special didn't bring in any new valuable information. Usually when something is aired publicly alongside a monetary reward, there's an influx of calls, and the bigger issue is flushing out who has legitimate information and who the people are who are just trying to get attention or trying to go after the money. So, in October of 1996, 6 years after her son's murder, Margaret Bergstrom wrote a letter alongside her family to be published in the paper. I'm going to read it for you. It's titled, "Message to a Killer." To the editor, the following letter is submitted to your newspaper for publication in the hope that the person it pertains to will read it and have a conscience. Nelson Lewis Jones, age 11, was murdered on October 27, 1990, by person or persons not yet in custody. The prime suspect is still living in the surrounding communities. A $5,000 reward is still being offered by the KBI for information leading to the arrest and conviction for the murder of Nelson L. Jones. I hope you deem it worthy to print. Sincerely, Bergstrom Jones family. I know who you are and where you've been. You may think I've forgotten or don't care anymore. Hardly. I think of you frequently because you are a coward and a thief. You stole a life and then left town. You're deceiving yourself. You may act as though you have no conscience, but God is watching you. I cannot forgive you for your cowardice. You've been hiding for 6 years. You brought to my family fear. You took from us a son, a brother, and a grandson. You took a future you had no right to, a present we're dealing with, and a past with memories you cannot take away. You know who you are. You're the murderer of Nelson Jones, an 11-year-old, a baseball player, a dog lover, a child. You did this 6 years ago, on October 27th, 1990. There are persons who know of your existence and your past. Maybe one day they'll give you up. Maybe one day you will give yourself up. Until that time, I am waiting and watching. I am hoping you will not take another life and cause another family grief. Until you come forward, do not ask forgiveness and do not forget. I won't. Margaret Bergstrom, Nelson's mother. The letter really made me think. Did investigators and the family have their eye on a strong suspect and they just didn't have enough evidence to arrest them? Was this a strategic move in conjunction with law enforcement to rattle someone who was in their sights? Is it possible that part of the unreleased criminal profile from the FBI says something like the suspect likely left town, and so they had the mother include that to make the suspect think they know more than they did? It's hard to know. That's just some thoughts I had, and the letter really does make me think that she's speaking directly to someone and she knows who they are. One person who always comes up in Kansas cases, and does so for this one, never by police but on message boards and Reddit threads, is Dennis Rader, also known as BTK Killer. He was the most prolific serial killer in Kansas history, and his methodology was the BTK, to bind, torture, and kill his victims. He operated in the Wichita area and Park City, Kansas area. While there was one instance of him killing a little boy alongside the rest of his family, Dennis Rader targeted mostly women who lived alone. And just as a quick aside, he got caught because he did something very dumb. He had taunted police for years with all of these letters, and he had writings that he wanted to get to police. So in one of them, he asked if he gave this writing to them on a floppy disk, if it could be traced. And of course the police were like, no, of course not. Your floppy disk is safe with us. And they used all the metadata embedded in this Microsoft Word doc, which had the words Christ Lutheran Church on it and last modified by Dennis. And that was legit how they were able to figure out who he was, because he worked at that church. So he's in jail forever, and they keep finding cases connected to them. And I just wanted to say that piece about him getting caught, because sometimes we look at these serial killers and perpetrators of crimes as these criminal masterminds, but the reality is they just got away with it and the clock is ticking, and he eventually got caught, and the same could be said for the person who did this to Nelson. But going back to Dennis Rader for a moment, I just don't think that Nelson is one of his victims. Rader had a ton of planning in his cases. I won't say I'm a BTK expert, but I know he used to do things like disable people's alarm systems, and he would take notes and watch victims for long periods of time. And this is a very tiny town, as I've mentioned a few times now, and it would be really difficult to hide out unnoticed in that and just kind of show up. And Dennis Rader is a really distinctive looking guy, so him just showing up in town and lingering around, doesn't make any sense. And this was a spur of the moment crime in terms of this was his first time being home alone. So do I think that Dennis Rader was waiting in his house like he did with most victims? No. Is it impossible? No, but I do think the percentage is almost zero. In 1998, the KBI created a new task force to target old cases. Among those being looked at were Nelson's alongside 200 others in the state of Kansas. KBI agent Larry Thomas said of Nelson's case that this is a small town and a small window of opportunity. He said, quote, "I think the answers are there. It's getting people to come forward," end quote. But nobody has. In 2022, the Kansas Department of Corrections created a deck of cold case playing cards. If you're unfamiliar, cold case playing cards are a tool used by putting cold cases on decks of cards that are distributed within state prison inmates at different correctional facilities, and the hope is that it sparks conversation within the prison to drum up new leads. Nelson is the youngest victim featured in the deck, and he is the 3 of hearts. In an interview done around the time of the cold case playing cards being distributed, his sister Melissa said, quote, "I often think about what life would be like if he were here. What kind of brother would he be? What kind of uncle would he be to my children? Would we have competed in sports in high school?" End quote. When Melissa is interviewed about the day of the crime, you can tell the pain in her voice is just as fresh and as enormously grief-filled as the day it happened. And still, when she talks about the happy memories of her brother, her love shows through just as strong and just as vibrantly. Melissa and her sister and other surviving relatives deserve answers. Unfortunately, her mother and stepfather passed away without ever getting them here on Earth. I know I say this often, but someone knows something. Was this a teen and you were a peer of the teen back then? Did a friend back then say something that made you uncomfortable and you maybe even just passed it off as a joke? Come forward and say something because you never know. Is Margaret's letter to the killer true? Did he just run off to a new town? If so, have there been similar crimes in other towns around Kansas? Was this an adult who could have groomed Nelson? Or a trusted member of the community? Someone who Nelson would have let into his home and wouldn't have thought twice about it? Was it someone who just noticed he was home alone that day and was lying in wait? Did he strike this up as an opportunity? Did someone come up and say, "Hey, let's go play video games," and use that as a way to enter the house? A couple of sources did cite the Nintendo cords as something that maybe were used as the weapon for strangulation. So do police still have those things? Can they test them with new technology? Are there other items to be tested that they haven't yet? I'm wondering what DNA evidence they have. Even though DNA wasn't well known back then, testing has come such a long way, and if there's evidence that had been preserved, I wonder what they're doing with it. At the time of this recording, Nelson would have just celebrated his 45th birthday. I want to end by sharing a poem shared by Dennis, Margaret, Melissa, and Elizabeth in November of 1990, a few weeks after Nelson's death. They wrote it to thank all of those who gave, as they said, so generously at this time with prayers, food, donations, and shoulders to cry upon. The poem is called In Memory of Nelson L. Jones. At heaven's gate there stands a child with big blue eyes and a winning smile. He wants to talk to someone inside, and he pushes the doors very wide. He says, "I'm Nelson. I came to say hi. I lived upon the earth a while. I brought home frogs and sometimes bugs, and Mom would find them in the rugs. I loved my family, loved my dog, liked to fish from upon a log. Baseball was my favorite sport. Next was the basketball court. Do you have hot dogs, cereal, and fries, and a parakeet that sometimes flies? I sure will miss those things below." "I know you will," said a voice so low. "But don't you worry, for someday, people you love will be on their way, and you can show them through this door, and we'll be together forevermore." If you have any information on the murder of Nelson Jones, please call 1-800-572-7463. This has been A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please share this podcast with your friends and leave a review on the platform you're listening on. We have a Facebook page called A Simpler Time True Crime Podcast and an Instagram @SimplerTimeCrimePod. Thank you so much for listening.